April 22. Aboard the battleship Yamato, anchored at Hashima, in Japan's inland sea, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat alone in his cabin, staring at the operational plan for what would become known as Operation Me. The attack on Midway at the plan was massive, complex, and elegant. On paper, it was a masterpiece of naval strategy. Multiple fleets, diversionary attacks, a decisive battle that would lure the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet to their destruction. But as Yamamoto read through the details, a cold dread settled in his stomach. He'd been a naval officer for over 30 years. He'd planned operations, commanded fleets, studied strategy, and everything about this plan felt wrong. Too complex, too many moving parts, too many assumptions. And most troublingly, it was based on a premise that Yamamoto, unlike most of his colleagues, knew was dangerously false. That America was weak, demoralized, and incapable of fighting back effectively. Yamamoto knew better because unlike most Japanese officers, he'd actually lived in America. He'd studied at Harvard. He'd served as a naval attaché in Washington. He'd traveled across the country, seen the factories, the oil fields, the vast industrial infrastructure, and he understood with a clarity that terrified him that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant. A giant that once fully roused would crush Japan under an avalanche of steel, oil, and industrial might that no amount of Japanese fighting spirit could overcome. He tried to warn his superiors before Pearl Harbor. He told them that Japan could only win a short war, 6 months, maybe a year. After that, American industrial production would overwhelm them. They dismissed his concerns. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been a stunning success. The victories that followed across the Pacific and Indian Ocean had convinced everyone that Yamamoto was being pessimistic. Now looking at the Midway plan, Yamamoto knew the window was closing, and this operation, this overly ambitious gamble, might be the mistake that slammed it shut forever. But he was trapped. The plan had already been approved by Imperial General Headquarters. The Emperor himself had been briefed. To oppose it now would be to question the judgment of his superiors and the wisdom of the High Command. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, such dissent was not merely discouraged. It was career-ending, possibly life-ending. So, Yamamoto did what competent men throughout history have done when trapped in systems that punish truth-telling. He followed orders. He prepared the fleet, and he hoped, desperately, that his fears were unfounded. They weren't. Yamamoto had studied the Midway operational plan with the eye of someone who understood both Japanese naval doctrine and American capabilities. And with each reading, the problems became more apparent. The plan was based on several key assumptions. First, that Japanese naval codes were secure, and the Americans had no idea an attack was coming. Second, that American carriers were still in Pearl Harbor and could be caught by surprise. Third, that the diversionary attack on the Aleutians would draw American forces north. Fourth, that Midway's defenses could be quickly neutralized. And fifth, that when American ships did respond, they would be caught piecemeal and destroyed. Yamamoto had serious doubts about every single assumption. During a planning meeting with his staff, he'd raised concerns about the code security. What if the Americans have broken JN-25? What if they know we're coming? His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matt Ugaki, had been dismissive. The code is unbreakable. Our cryptographers have assured us, and even if the Americans intercept some messages, they can't possibly decrypt them in time to matter. Yamamoto had pressed the issue. The Americans are not stupid. They have skilled code readers. We should assume our communications are compromised and plan accordingly. Ugi had grown impatient. Admiral, with respect, you're being overly cautious. We've achieved total surprise at every operation since Pearl Harbor. There's no reason to think this will be different. But Yamamoto knew there was a reason. The Doolittle raid the previous month, when American bombers had actually struck Tokyo itself, had been a devastating psychological blow. The bombers had launched from carriers that had somehow approached Japan undetected and then escaped. That suggested American intelligence and operational capability far better than Japanese planners were assuming. Yamamoto had also questioned the complexity of the plan. Multiple fleets spread across thousands of miles of ocean, all operating on precise timints without radio communication. The margin for error was razor thin. What if the timing is off? He'd asked. What if one element is delayed? The entire plan depends on perfect coordination. Again, his concerns had been waved away. Our sailors are the best in the world. They will execute the plan as designed. The most troubling assumption to Yamamoto was about American carrier locations. The plan assumed the carriers were in Pearl Harbor and would take days to reach Midway after the attack began. But what if they weren't? What if American intelligence had warned them? What if they were already at sea, waiting? We need better reconnaissance, Yamamoto had insisted. We need to know exactly where the American carriers are before we commit to the attack. But the reconnaissance plan was already flawed. A planned seaplane flight over Pearl Harbor to verify carrier locations had been canceled due to concerns about detection. A submarine picket line that was supposed to spot American ships leaving Pearl Harbor was positioned too late. The Americans had already sailed. Yamamoto could see the disaster taking shape, but he couldn't stop it. The plan had momentum. The fleet was being assembled. The die was cast. In a private moment with one of his most trusted officers, Yamamoto had been grimly honest. This operation troubles me. We're making too many assumptions about enemy weakness and our own invincibility. If even one of our assumptions is wrong, if the Americans are waiting for us, this could end very badly. But surely, Admiral, our carrier force is superior. The Kidai has never been defeated. Yamamoto had looked out at the assembled fleet, the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled. Never defeated, yes, but also never tested against an enemy who knows we're coming. Victory disease has infected our planning. We believe our own propaganda, and that's when mistakes happen. Before the operation launched, a series of war games were conducted aboard the Yamato. These exercises were meant to test the plan, identify weaknesses, and refine tactics. What actually happened was a preview of the disaster to come and a demonstration of how deeply victory disease had infected Japanese planning. Yamamoto observed the games with growing unease. The officer playing the American side, attempting to think like an American commander, made a bold move. He launched a surprise carrier strike on the Japanese fleet while it was recovering aircraft from the Midway attack. The umpires calculated the results. 2 Japanese carriers would be hit and put out of action, possibly sunk. The Japanese strike would be delayed or disrupted. The carefully choreographed plan would collapse into chaos. It was a stunning preview of exactly what would happen in the real battle, but Rear Admiral Ugaki, serving as chief umpire, simply overruled the results. Such an outcome is unrealistic, he declared. American morale is broken. They won't be that aggressive. The carriers are restored to operational status. Yamamoto had watched this intervention with dismay. The war game had just shown them precisely what could go wrong. And rather than address it, rather than adjust the plan, they'd simply erase the problem. He'd spoken up carefully. Perhaps we should consider what would happen if the American carriers do attack during our most vulnerable moment. How would we respond? Ugi had been firm. Admiral Yamamoto, the scenario is too unlikely to merit serious consideration. We're planning for realistic contingencies, not worst-case fantasies. But to Yamamoto, who understood American fighting spirit better than his colleagues, it wasn't a fantasy. It was exactly what an aggressive, well-informed American commander would do. Strike at the moment of maximum Japanese vulnerability when their decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. The war game had handed them the answer. They'd been shown their weakness, and they'd chosen to ignore it because acknowledging it would mean admitting the plan was flawed. And in the Imperial Japanese Navy of 1942, questioning an approved plan was tantamount to questioning the Emperor's divine will. Yamamoto left the war games with a sense of foreboding he couldn't shake. They were about to sail into battle based on a plan that had already been shown to be vulnerable, but whose vulnerabilities had been deliberately ignored. June 4th, 1942. Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the Yamato, the most powerful battleship ever built, 300 mm behind the carrier strike force. The main body of the combined fleet was arrayed around him. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, overwhelming firepower. All of it useless because this wasn't going to be a battleship fight. It was a carrier battle, and Yamamoto's carriers were too far ahead for him to influence the action. This was another flaw in the plan. The fleet was dispersed over such vast distances that the different elements couldn't support each other. Yamamoto's battleships, which might have provided additional anti-aircraft defense for the carriers, were a full day sailing away. If something went wrong, he could do nothing but watch. The early reports had been positive. The strike on Midway had launched successfully. The base was being hit. Some American aircraft had counterattacked, but they'd been driven off without scoring a single hit. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. Then came the message that changed everything. Enemy force of 10 ships sighted. Yamamoto felt his blood run cold. The Americans were already here, not in Pearl Harbor, not days away. Here now, waiting. His worst fear had come true. The Americans had known. They'd broken the code. They'd set a trap. And the Kadai had sailed right into it. Minutes later, another message. Enemy force includes what appears to be a carrier. Yamamoto's staff erupted in discussion. How could this be? The intelligence had been clear. The American carriers were supposed to be in port. This was impossible. But Yamamoto knew it wasn't impossible. It was exactly what he'd feared. The Americans had read their mail. They'd known where and when to be. And now Admiral Nagumo, commanding the carrier force, was facing the battle of his life against an enemy that had achieved complete surprise. Yamamoto issued orders to increase speed to try to close the distance. But he knew it was futile. Even at flank speed, the Yamato couldn't reach the battle area before nightfall. Whatever happened out there, Nagumo was on his own. The morning dragged on with agonizing slowness. Messages from the carrier force were sporadic, confused. American torpedo bombers were attacking. They were being driven off. Nagumo was recovering his strike aircraft and preparing a counterattack. Then at 10:30 a message that made Yamamoto's heart stop. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu hit by dive bombers. Heavy fires. Silence fell across the bridge of the Yamato. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 3 carriers hit simultaneously. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be happening. But it was. Within minutes, more details arrived. All 3 carriers were burning out of control. Secondary explosions from stored ordnance were tearing them apart. The air groups were being evacuated. The ships were being abandoned. Yamamoto stood frozen, staring at the messages. In a span of perhaps 5 minutes, the heart of the Japanese carrier force had been ripped out. The Kitobai, invincible for 6 months, had been destroyed. His staff looked to him for orders, for guidance. But what orders could he give? He was 300 minutes away. The battle was lost. The plan had collapsed exactly as he'd feared it would. One of his officers, voice shaking, asked, "Admiral, should we proceed with the invasion? Perhaps the battleships can provide gunfire support." Yamamoto shook his head. Without carriers, without air cover, the invasion force would be slaughtered by American air power. The operation was over. More than over. It was a catastrophe. Order Admiral Nagumo to withdraw the remaining forces. Cancel the invasion. All units are to retire to the west. It was one of the hardest orders he'd ever given. An admission of total defeat. But there was no alternative. To continue would be to compound the disaster. As the reports continued to come in throughout the day, the scale of the defeat became clear. Not just 3 carriers, but 4. The Hiru, after launching a desperate counterattack, had also been hit and was sinking. Over 3,000 men were dead or dying. And with them, Japan's most experienced naval aviators, the irreplaceable core of Japanese naval air power. That night, alone in his cabin, Yamamoto faced the reality of what had happened. The plan he'd had doubts about, the operation he'd questioned, had failed exactly as he'd feared. And because he'd lacked the courage to oppose it more forcefully, because he'd valued his position over his convictions, thousands of men were dead, and Japan's strategic position was crippled. He thought back to his time in America, to the factories he'd toured, the oil fields, the shipyards. He'd tried to tell his colleagues that Japan couldn't win a long war against such industrial might. They'd dismissed him as too cautious, too impressed by American material power. But he'd been right. And Midway had just proven it. The Americans had lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, but they had more coming, many more. SX-class carriers were already under construction, dozens of them. Japan had just lost 4 of its 6 fleet carriers. The remaining 2, Shokaku and Zuikaku, had been damaged in earlier battles and weren't present at Midway. Japan's carrier building program couldn't replace the lost ships for years. And even if they could, where would they find pilots to match the experienced veterans who'd just been lost? The arithmetic was brutal. America could afford losses. Japan could not. And the window for a Japanese victory, always narrow, had just slammed shut. In the days following Midway, Yamamoto faced another agonizing decision: how to report the disaster to Imperial General Headquarters and the Emperor. The full truth would be catastrophic to morale. It would validate all the warnings he'd given that had been dismissed. It would prove that American capability had been underestimated and Japanese invincibility was a myth. And most dangerously, it would raise questions about the entire war strategy. Yamamoto's staff urged him to minimize the losses in the official report. We can say we lost 2 carriers, not 4. We can emphasize the damage inflicted on the Americans. We can present it as a tactical setback, not a strategic disaster. Yamamoto knew this was wrong. He knew that hiding the truth would prevent the Navy from learning the right lessons, from making the necessary changes. But he also understood the political reality. To fully reveal the scale of the defeat would cause chaos in the high command, might even threaten the entire war effort. In the end, he compromised. The official report acknowledged the loss of all 4 carriers, but downplayed the loss of pilots and aircrew. It emphasized the damage to the Yorktown and suggested the Americans had suffered proportional losses. It was truth mixed with obfuscation, an honest assessment wrapped in face-saving language. But even this partial honesty was too much for some in the high command. The surviving officers from the battle were quarantined upon return to Japan. They were forbidden from discussing what had happened, even with family. The official propaganda proclaimed Midway as a great victory. The lost carriers were kept on the Navy's official roster for months, their status listed as ambiguous. This culture of denial meant the Navy never fully came to terms with what had gone wrong. The flaws in the plan, the overconfidence, the intelligence failures, none of it was properly examined, because to do so would require admitting the magnitude of the defeat. Yamamoto participated in this cover-up, and it haunted him. As a professional who valued truth and accurate assessment, he understood that they were repeating the same mistakes that had led to Midway in the first place, ignoring uncomfortable realities, dismissing evidence that contradicted their worldview. In private conversations with trusted officers, Yamamoto was blunt. We lost at Midway because we underestimated the Americans and overestimated ourselves. We assumed our codes were secure when they weren't. We assumed the Americans were weak when they weren't. We assumed we could fight a battle on our terms when we couldn't. Every assumption was wrong. Can we win this war? One young officer asked him directly. Yamamoto paused before answering. No, not as things stand. We won a short war in the first 6 months, but that window is closed. Now we're fighting the long war I warned about against an enemy with industrial capacity we can't match. Every ship they lose, they build 3 more. Every pilot we lose, we can't replace. The mathematics are against us. Then what do? Yamamoto had no good answer. We fight. We defend. We hope for a negotiated peace before we are completely overwhelmed. But hope is not a strategy. In the months after Midway, Yamamoto watched his predictions come true. With grim inevitability. The Americans launched their offensive at Guadalcanal in August 1942. What followed was a brutal, grinding campaign that lasted 6 months. Japan fought desperately to hold the island. The Navy committed cruisers, destroyers, and the remaining carriers to a series of naval battles around Guadalcanal. Some were Japanese victories. Most were American victories or costly draws. But the pattern was unmistakable. Every engagement depleted Japan's irreplaceable pool of experienced pilots and sailors. Meanwhile, American forces grew stronger. New ships arrived, new aircraft, fresh, well-trained pilots. The industrial advantage Yamamoto had warned about was becoming undeniable reality. At the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942, Japanese carrier aircraft severely damaged the USS Enterprise and sank the USS Hornet. On paper, it was a victory. But the Japanese lost 99 aircraft and their pilots. The Americans lost 81. And while American losses would be replaced within months, Japanese losses were permanent. Yamamoto called it a hollow victory. They were winning battles, but losing the war. The mathematics of attrition were inexorable. By early 1943, the strategic situation was clear. Japan had been forced onto the defensive. The initiative belonged to America, and American production was ramping up to levels that staggered even Yamamoto, who thought he understood their industrial capacity. Intelligence reports spoke of Essex-class carriers entering service at a rate of nearly 1 per month. Independence-class light carriers being converted from cruiser hulls in less than 2 years. thousands of aircraft rolling off assembly lines in places like Willow Run and Seattle. It was an industrial tsunami that Japan had no hope of matching. Yamamoto received reports on American aircraft production. In Tiger II, the United States had produced over 47,000 military aircraft. Japan had produced fewer than 9,000. The ratio was getting worse, not better. By 1943, American production would exceed 80,000 aircraft. Japanese production might reach 17,000 if they were lucky. The pilot training numbers were equally grim. American flight schools were graduating thousands of new aviators every month, each with hundreds of hours of training. Japanese training programs had been drastically shortened due to fuel shortages and the need to rush replacements to the front. New pilots were arriving at frontline units with minimal preparation, and their life expectancy was measured in weeks. Yamamoto had warned about exactly this scenario. A long war of attrition against an industrial power with virtually unlimited resources, and his warnings had been dismissed as defaced. Now the reality was undeniable, but it was too late to change course. April 18, 1943. Yamamoto was aboard a bomber, flying from Rabaul to inspect frontline forces in the Solomon Islands. It was a routine inspection tour, the kind of thing commanders did regularly to maintain morale and assess the tactical situation. But American couriers, the same ones who'd broken the JN-25 code before Midway, had intercepted and decrypted the flight plan. They knew exactly where Yamamoto would be. And when a flight of PD-8 Lightning fighters was dispatched to intercept him, they caught his plane exactly as scheduled, shot it down, and killed the admiral. Whether Yamamoto knew the end was coming, whether he suspected the Americans had read his mail one final time, is unknown. But there's a tragic irony in how he died. Killed by the same intelligence failure he'd warned about. The same American counter-recon capability that had doomed the Midway operation had now claimed his life. With Yamamoto's death, Japan lost its most capable naval strategist and the one senior officer who truly understood the war's strategic reality. His successors were either true believers in inevitable Japanese victory or political officers unwilling to speak uncomfortable truths. After the war, when historians and military analysts examined the Battle of Midway, Yamamoto's fears and warnings were completely vindicated. Every concern he'd raised had been legitimate. Every assumption he'd questioned had been wrong. The Americans had broken JN-25. They had known about the attack. They had been waiting. The plan had been too complex, and its execution had been compromised by rigid doctrine and poor tactical decisions. And the battle had been the turning point that doomed Japan's strategic position. American officers who interrogated surviving Japanese commanders were struck by a consistent theme. Many admitted that Yamamoto had been the only senior leader who truly understood American industrial capacity and the impossibility of winning a long war. One Japanese officer in his post-war debriefing said, "Admiral Yamamoto told us before the war that he could run wild for 6 months, but after that he had no confidence." Midway happened almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. He was right. But by the time we realized he was right, it was too late. The production numbers bore out Yamamoto's warnings completely. By the end of the war, the United States had produced over 300,000 military aircraft. Japan had produced about 76,000. American ship production exceeded all other nations combined. The industrial avalanche Yamamoto had warned about had buried Japan exactly as he'd predicted. The Battle of Midway had been the critical moment. Not because Japan couldn't have continued fighting after losing 4 carriers, but because it proved that every assumption underpinning Japanese strategy was false. American morale wasn't broken. American intelligence wasn't blind. American industrial capacity was even greater than Yamamoto had feared. And yet, none of Yamamoto's warnings had been heeded until it was too late. Like Admiral Canaris warning about American industrial capacity and being ignored. Like Albert Speer calculating that Germany couldn't win a production war and remaining silent. Like Adolf Galland recognizing American air superiority and being called a defeatist. In every case, competent professionals saw strategic reality clearly and were trapped in systems where truth was subordinate to ideology, where loyalty meant agreement, and where questioning approved plans was career-ending or worse. Yamamoto's story is a tragedy of knowledge without power. He understood American capability better than any other Japanese officer. He'd warned that Japan could only win a short war. He'd predicted that a long war would end in defeat. He'd questioned the Midway plan's assumptions. He'd tried to inject realistic assessment into strategic planning, and he'd been overruled, dismissed, or ignored every time. Not because his assessments were wrong, but because they contradicted what people wanted to believe. Victory disease, the conviction of inevitable Japanese superiority, was so deeply embedded in military culture that contradictory evidence was rejected automatically. The parallel to other stories of ignored expertise is striking. The Nazi engineer examining a P-47 and realizing Germany couldn't match American technology. The Wehrmacht general warning that the Ardennes offensive would fail for lack of fuel. The Luftwaffe commander recognizing that the Thunderbolt was superior to German fighters. In all these cases, the pattern is the same. Competent professionals provide accurate assessments. Those assessments are dismissed because they contradict ideology or doctrine. The predictions come true. Thousands die unnecessarily. And the people who were right receive no satisfaction from their vindication because they're either dead or watching their nations crumble. Yamamoto's final vindication was bitter. He'd been right about everything. The short war window, American industrial might, the Midway plan's flaws, the inevitable long war of attrition. But being right didn't save his men at Midway. It didn't prevent the war. It didn't lead to peace negotiations before total defeat. It just meant he had the agonizing experience of watching his every prediction come true while being powerless to prevent it. The lesson extends beyond World War II. When systems punish truth-telling and reward conformity, when ideology becomes more important than evidence, when loyalty means never questioning approved plans, catastrophic failure becomes inevitable. Midway wasn't lost in the 5 minutes of dive bomber attacks on June 4, 1942. It was lost in the months of planning when legitimate concerns were dismissed, when war games were rigged to produce favorable outcomes, when intelligence warnings were ignored. Yamamoto saw it all. He understood it, and he couldn't stop it. That's the real tragedy of Midway from the Japanese side. Not the loss of ships or the death of pilots, but the fact that it was all avoidable if anyone had been willing to listen to the one man who understood what they were really up against. In the end, reality doesn't negotiate. Mathematics doesn't care about fighting spirit. Industrial capacity trumps tactical brilliance. And the admiral who knew all of this, who tried to warn his nation, was silenced by the same cultural forces that ensured Japan's defeat. His wisdom was vindicated, but by then it was far too. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more forgotten battles, hidden histories, and untold soldier stories to life. And let me know your thoughts in the comments. What event or perspective would you like to see next? I read every comment.